Learning objectives. After completing this module, learners will be able to understand and the advent of modern agriculture in England. Understand and elaborate on the enclosure system in English agriculture. Understand and describe why the farmers suffered due to mechanization of agriculture. Understand and describe the breadbasket and dust bowl in America. Understand and describe in detail how machines helped in the expansion of cultivation in America. Understand and explain how opium was smuggled into China. Understand and describe why and how Indian farmers were forced to grow opium. The coming of modern agriculture in England. The time of open fields and commons. In the late 18th century and early 19th centuries, England witnessed riots initiated by men who feared losing their jobs to farming machines. They sent threat letters signed in the mythic name of Captain Swing to farmers to stop using machines. They were named Swing Rioters. Before this era, the English countryside, a vast open land, was not enclosed or owned by private owners. Villagers were allotted strips of land for cultivation. Beyond the cultivation strips, the land was open to all for different uses. In the 16th century, when the price of wool went up in the world market, the rich farmers expanded their area for improved sheep breeding. They enclosed compact blocks of land. Poor farmers were denied entry in enclosed fields. The British Parliament passed 4,000 acts legalizing these enclosures. New demands for grain. The English population multiplied at least 4 times between 1750 and 1900. Britain was also industrializing at the same time. Large numbers of villagers migrating to urban areas increased demand for food grains, which led to price rise. At the end of the 18th century, England's war with France disrupted trade and import of food grains from Europe. The scarcity of food grains caused steep prices rise. This motivated landowners to increase land area under food grain cultivation and increase profit margins. They pressurized the Parliament to pass enclosure acts. The age of enclosures. Unlike the established pattern of population growth leading to food shortages, in England, grain production grew almost in proportion to population growth in 1868. England was producing about 80% of the food it consumed. This did not happen due to advanced agricultural technology, but due to increase in land under cultivation. Crop production was boosted by simple methods of crop rotation. English farmers grew turnips and clover to increase the nitrogen content of soil. Nitrogen increased soil fertility. Enclosures were important to landowners as long-term investment to plant crop rotation, have control over large expanses of land, and increase production for market. What happened to the poor? By the end of 19th century, more and more land became the exclusive property of landowners when they put up fences and enclosed the land. The poor had no access to commons to graze cattle, collect fuel wood, collect fruits, go fishing in the ponds or rivers, or hunt small animals for meat. They were displaced from their land and stripped of their customary rights. Many were forced out of the Midland to southern countries where intensive and expansive cultivation took place. The demand for agricultural labor was great in this region, but they were employed for small wages only during the harvest time. This saved money for the landowners. The poor had to put up with job insecurity, low income, and unemployment for a large part of the year. The introduction of threshing machines. During the Napoleonic Wars, the price of food grains had shot up steeply. It encouraged landowners to expand area under cultivation. This is when threshing machines were introduced in England. More and more farmers bought threshing machines to lessen dependency on labor. They often feared a shortage of labor and often complained of the laborers' insolent behavior and drinking habits. After the war, the soldiers returned to their villages but could not find an alternative means to survive. Almost at the same time, supply of food grains from Europe had started again. It declined food grain prices. An agricultural depression set in. Landowners reduced the land under cultivation, employed lesser number of labor, paid lower wages, and demanded a ban on import of food grain. The poor people wandered from village to village in search of jobs. The laborers who had jobs always lived under the fear of losing it. The Captain Swing riots spread wide and far in the English countryside in protest against the use of agricultural machines. Agricultural machines were held responsible for the laborers losing employment. Threshing machines augured bad times for the poor laborers. Bread basket and dust bowl. The westward move and wheat cultivation. When the commons were being enclosed in England, settled agriculture was not prevalent in America. Till 1780, white Americans were confined to a narrow strip of along the eastern coast. Most of the land was occupied by the Native American Indians. After 1800, the American government devised policies to drive the natives to the westernmost part of America. The policies allowed displacement of locals and conversion of their land into agricultural belts. Initially, the American Indians were driven beyond the Mississippi River, but by 1860, the white settlers poured into the Great Plains across the Mississippi. The fertile soil here produced good yield. This region became a major wheat-producing area of America. The wheat farmers. By 19th century, the U.S. urban population was increasing, and simultaneously, the export market too was expanding. Farmers were encouraged to grow wheat due to its high demand and increased prices. The demand grew even more during the First World War, when the Russian supply of wheat was suspended and America supplied wheat to Europe. In 1910, wheat was cultivated in about 45 million acres of land in the USA. By 1919, the area expanded to 74 million acres. Many big farmers controlled as much as 2,000 to 3,000 acres of land individually. The coming of new technology. When the white settlers entered the Midwestern prairie, the simple plows they used in the East Coast proved ineffective. The prairie was covered with a thick mat of grass with deep and tough roots. A variety of new ploughs were invented locally to break the tough surface or sod and turn the soil over. The first mechanical reaper was also invented in 1831. The new machines were useful to big farmers. Their work could be done fast with minimum manual labor. The production increased, which meant larger profits. What happened to the poor? Machines spelt misery for the poor farmers. Some bought new machines with loan but could never pay back their debts. They gave up farming to look for alternative jobs. Mechanization reduced the need for labor. There were no jobs. The boom experienced in the late 19th and early 20th century died down. Food grain was available in excess. The wheat prices fell. Export market collapsed. It created circumstances leading to the Great Agrarian Depression of 1930. Dust Bowl. The overzealous white settlers of USA recklessly stripped vast lands of the grass cover to create wheat fields. Break sod into dust turned the region into a vast dust bowl. The ecology of the region was threatened. The ordinary dust storms took the shape of dark blizzards. There had been no rain years after years in the early 1930s. The combined effect of these two caused terrifying dust storms in southern plains. The Indian farmer and opium production. A taste for tea, the trade with China. In the late 18th century, Chinese tea became very popular in England, but importing tea was not profitable to East India Company as there was no product to sell back to China. Manchus, the Confucian rulers of China, never allowed entry of foreign merchants into China to prevent them from meddling in local politics. The English merchants had to pay in silver or bullions to buy tea from China. It was a huge drain on the nation's treasury. The English merchants finally zeroed in on opium. Aware of opium addiction, the Chinese emperor had restricted its use for medicinal purposes only. In the mid-18th century, Western merchants illegally began opium trade with Chinese merchants. Years later, while the English enjoyed Chinese tea, the Chinese became addicted to opium. Where did opium come from? Britain's illegal opium trade with China was booming. To increase opium supplies, the Indian farmers were forced to grow opium. Indian cultivators resisted growing opium firstly because opium had to be grown on the best fields meant for pulses. Growing opium meant either not cultivating pulses or cultivating them in inferior lands. Secondly, cultivators had to lease land from landlords for a very high rent. Thirdly, growing opium demanded long hours for nurturing. They could not spare time to grow other crops. Lastly, the government price to buy opium from cultivators was too low. It made growing opium an unprofitable affair. How were unwilling cultivators made to produce opium? After the Battle of Plassey, 1757, the British gradually expanded their rule in India. They went on to produce opium in the lands under their control. In the interiors of Bihar and Bengal, the village headman would pay advance to the poorest people to produce opium. They were also advanced loans. People accepted loans in the hope of paying it back gradually. Unfortunately, they could never do so. Through the loan, they would get bound to the village headsman and indirectly to the colonial government, as the government opium agents were paying money to the headman to forward to the villagers. In return, people were forced to work in specific opium fields and hand over the produce to the government opium agent at low prices. The cultivator could neither grow a crop of his choice nor sell the produce to someone else. By early 18th century, peasants began agitating for higher prices. They refused to take advances. Many cultivators in regions around Benares, now Varanasi, began growing sugarcane and potatoes instead. Others sold off their crop to travelling traders, paikas, who offered higher prices. By 1820s, the British observed a decline in opium production in their territories and an increase in areas not under their control, like the princely states of Rajasthan and central India. To retain its monopoly, the colonial government instructed its agents in the princely states to confiscate all opium and destroy the crops. Summary. Let us summarize what we have learnt. The swing rioters protested against mechanized farming in England in late 18th and early 19th century. Around this time, the open fields in England were given away to enclosed fields. Crop production was boosted by simple methods of crop rotation. When the poor lost their customary rights to the commons, they were forced to work as agricultural labor. During Napoleonic Wars, threshing machines were introduced in England. Around 1780, the white Americans started moving westward, displacing the Native American Indians. By 1860, the white settlers had spread into the Great Plains across the Mississippi. By 1919, the area under wheat cultivation expanded to 74 million acres in America. The first mechanical reaper was also invented in 1831. The new machines were useful to big farmers. The Great Agrarian Depression took place in 1930. Stripped of vast lands of the grass cover to create wheat fields threatened the ecology of the Mississippi region. In the mid-18th century, Western merchants illegally began opium trade with Chinese merchants. To increase opium supplies, the Indian farmers were forced to grow opium.